much that you're enjoying as you listen to this presentation. Um, Anyone who knows Robert or myself knows of our passion for Huntington history. We've researched it, we've written articles and books about it collectively and individually, given talks, set up historic exhibits. And so we thought maybe during this time that we would try this format to see if you would enjoy discussing an aspect of Huntington's history with us. Today, the topic we've chosen is the beginning of Huntington's history, really. We decided to start at the beginning, which is the discussion of the early settlement of Huntington dating back to its founding in 1653, and where that settlement took place, and then the transition of that area into what it is today and what we continue to hope it's going to be in the future. So if we look at the first slide, which we're going to see this map in a little better detail, what we're seeing is where the first settlement was really made. And in 1653, they decided to lay out a town plat, which you see there. It's called Huntington Park. It's a 1873 atlas, but it really reflects pretty much the roads that were there in 1653, some 200 years earlier, which would have been trails and dirt paths that the Native Americans were using. But in the early days, 1663, they decided to lay out what they called a town plat, and that is illustrated here in green at the Huntington, and called the Huntington Park. It runs along Park Avenue, and you'll notice it's not nearly as big as what we consider today to be the Huntington Town Green. You'll see Main Street running up through and turning left almost to the East Main Street, which is the road to Northport, which is today, of course, 25A. The main road, as you can see, almost went from Main Street to Park Avenue in southeast. That was the more common path. There was a part of Park Avenue extended north of Main Street and went on to the harbor. It was really the only road to the east side of the harbor. It was the main road anyway to the east side of Huntington Harbor, which is where an early settlement was also formed. So we're going to look at this map. This map shows a number of structures on it that we're going to actually see historic pictures of. We don't have too many historic pictures of that what existed in 1653, obviously. But we're going to try to describe that and why the initial settlement is where it is today. So in 1653, there was a group of men from Salem, Massachusetts that started sailing around Long Island Sound looking for property. And they landed in Oyster Bay in the early part of the year and made a purchase that is considered the town of Oyster Bay, and then traveled east in April and purchased, I don't know whether they had an appointment with Chief Ashroken or not, but they found Chief Ashroken and they made a purchase of which is considered the first purchase of 8 square miles. And in 1938, when Romanus Samus, who was president of the Huntington Historical Society, wrote a book on the history of Huntington and Babylon. Babylon was part of Huntington until 1872. She talks about what the trip from Oyster Bay to the land that becomes Huntington must have looked like. It would travel over the foot of Cold Spring Harbor, and then they were faced with a steep hill up straight ahead, or they could have bent north and followed this trail of 25A. And in any case, they would end up at what was called the top of Cold Spring Hill, looking into what is one of 3 valleys that she describes. And this is the western view of Huntington Village. Now, it was done, it's a woodcut that was done in 1843. And so you see a beginning of a town moving to this area. And this may be the reason that the early settlement is as preserved as it is, and so it's well worth saving, is that most early settlements, the town that expanded grew out from the center of that early settlement. In our case, it really moved to a different valley, as we'll see. So this was the Westernmost Valley. It was a large flat valley. There was no definable river. There were 3 trails that led to the south, and in the rainstorms, it would make it a very marshy area, which we consider Main Street today. But then as you went through that valley, and they chose not to put the early settlement here, You go up the first hill out of the valley, which today, of course, is looks like this with these three historic buildings. One is, actually, there's a fourth building that's just been torn down. But you'll recognize this. This goes up past the old burying ground. And they chose at the top of that hill to put the old burying ground, which served Huntington from the 17th into the 19th century. And then as you passed the trade school building, you'd go down into a second valley. And this is a painting that was done in 1868 that's in the collection of Old First Church, and shows the valley, shows the road that goes down that hill. That's Nassau Road going off to your right. And you see Old First up ahead, but into the second valley, which had a definable stream to it. And that was necessary for a settlement, but it did not have, it wasn't very wide. And that's what we call Spring Street today. And of course, Spring Street got its name because of the stream that ran through it. They chose to put the first meeting house at the corner down at this valley, but they still, it wasn't large enough to build houses and to lay out town plots. So they went up the hill, past what became the Old First Church. The first church was built in 1715, but was torn down or used during the Revolution. This church was built after the Revolution. But then we go into the third valley, which was a much broader valley, had plenty of water. As you can see, and I didn't point out in that first map, and I meant to, but there was a pond that you see on the left-hand slide. You'll see the arsenal off in the distance there. But that was really right across the street from the corner, or at the southwest corner of in the old town plot. It's no longer there, obviously, but the stream still runs through it. You can still see the water that gathers in this 2013 photograph. So the next slide shows that pond. We're looking across that pond up into where the Art Cinema is today and the town's senior center is. And you'll see a building there that was originally the Wicks farmhouse that later became the poorhouse in the 19th century, in the early 19th century. Thomas Wicks owned that property, and there's a plaque that stands that we're going to see later. But in 1663, in the town meeting, the men were named to lay out fields and home lots. And home lots were going to be in this settlement. Fields would be on the extremities of the settlement, and to lay out, and this may not be prejudicial to the commons or the town plat. So there was a difference to common fields and the town plat. The town plat, of course, is what we consider part of the Huntington Green. It was agreed that it should be fenced, and they named some men to fence it to keep the calves and the sheep and the horses and the hogs out of it. And it was, but again, there was a constant reference to not being prejudicial to the highways, the watering places for cattle, and the watercourses. And at that town meeting, they also banned geese. The law against geese was because it would be great hurt done to our common pasture and in our brooks. I'm not so sure they were very successful with that, but they did ban geese as early as 1663. Okay, this is on the plaque that indicates that Thomas Wicks, who owned the land up above the town plat, kind of encroached onto the town plat. And at some point they said, no, you're not supposed to do that. And they made an agreement in 1739 that they would sell, Thomas Wicks would sell the land back to the town, and so it would be common forever in the town spot, and reestablish that as the common land for the everybody in town. This is an interesting map, and it kind of tends to show the layout of the early roads, I think. This was done from memory, I think, in about 1880, but it was a child who would have been 12 years old. He grew up in the Kissam house. His name was Edward Kissam, and he remembering the town as of 1830. And you can see where Main Street, where the Presbyterian Church there on the left is circled. Across the street is the Academy, which is where Town Hall is today. And Park Avenue, where I've also circled in red the Kissam House, is on the same side of a straight road. Well, the road isn't straight, but you can see that there was a sharp left-hand turn to the road to Cow Harbor. Now, today, of course, that's 25A in the main road, and we'll see how they made an effort to straighten it out. Now, in this young boy's memory, it was just a little path that was a sharp left-hand turn off the main road. You also see the extension of Park Avenue that goes to the landing, which would have been the east side of the harbor. And you can see he identifies where the town plat was, and I've got that in a rectangular green box. Sorry, my phone is ringing. And as well as he identifies where the tannery was and some of the other historic houses that we'll look at later. Well, again, this is the photograph of the church. Is at the top of the hill as you're coming over that first valley. I think we already saw that. But across the street from that was the Huntington Academy. That wasn't built till 1794, but the first school teacher, was actually hired in 1657. And he had a plot of land that is now part of the village green across the street, just east of the church. So you can see where the school and the church were fit into this original plat. And this was the second church that was built in the 18th century, the mid-18th century, which is the St. John's Episcopal Church. It's celebrating its 275th anniversary this year. And it was situated across from the hospital, right next to where the AME church is today. You can see that they still own the graveyard that was sitting behind it. You can see the tombstone in this painting to the left. This is a recent restored painting by James Long Scudder, who was a local painter who painted in the late 19th century. And it will be used in an exhibit on the history of the St. John's Church that we're putting up in the museum at Soldiers and Sailors.
So, as Toby said, the Village Green is very important as the first location of the development in the town of Huntington, location where the schools and the churches were. And the Daughters of the American Revolution, which was founded in Huntington in the early 1900s, wanted to mark historic spots such as this. They put several boulders around that. Thomas Wicks Memorial we saw earlier on the millstone was put up by the DAR. And this is a boulder with a bronze plaque that they put on the north side of the Village Green in 1909. It's Helen Irwin and John Wood, whose parents were both involved in the Sons and Daughters of the American Revolution. And that granite boulder is still there, still has this plaque, which talks about how the blockhouse was here for protection with Indians, even though there really weren't too many Indians by the time the settlers came. Early town meetings were held here and the militia drilled during Revolutionary War times. So as important as the site was, and it was marked as an important site by the DAR, just 20 years after that boulder was marked, you can see how overgrown the Village Green became. Nobody was taking care of it. It was a dumping ground. There was all sorts of trash in there, including the carcass of a Ford machine, according to the newspapers. And it was decided that something had to be done. The Great Depression was just starting, so people needed jobs. There were a network of committees known as the Roadside Committee in just about every town on Long Island. Huntington had one. Florence Baker was in charge of the committee. And she suggested that the town hire workers, unemployed people, to clean up the Village Green and other areas around town, and bring this back to what it should be. So this is before they did their cleanup, and afterwards, you can see how much better it is. They've gotten rid of all the overgrowth, cut down some trees, and removed all the trash. So the place was in much better shape after 1932. One of the people involved with the Roadside Committee was Henry White Cannon, who lived across the street on Park Avenue from the Village Green. He had purchased a house that was built in 1805. In 1915 is when he made the purchase. And he was president of Chase Manhattan Bank. He and Florence Baker and some other wealthy residents such as Marshall Field, Raymond Ingersoll, Henry Saylor, and the Reverend Humston from Old First Church evolved the roadside committee into something called the Old Huntington Green Association. And Henry Cannon was a very important player in that organization. This is his house, which still stands on Park Avenue before you get to the hospital. And on this map, this is the Cannon house over here. And here is the historic village green outlined in green. In that earlier map that Toby showed, there was a pond over here in 1873. By 1917, it had kind of migrated up here. I'm not sure how that happened, but I'm sure there was some help from machinery. What we want to talk about next is this parcel up here. This is the Hoban Farm historically. Toby mentioned the early schoolhouse from 1657 was somewhere on this property. By the 19th century, it was owned by a gentleman named Matthew Hoban, and it was believed the first Catholic masses in the town of Huntington were said in his house, which is down here on Main Street. By 1917, it was owned by a gentleman named Richard Kenny. He sold it to Edward Kringle, and Kringle came up with a plan to subdivide this property into 25 building lots. This is just to show that there's the dividing line between the traditional village green and what comes next, which is maybe a little confusing. Let me just go back. So Kringle was going to subdivide all this property. And that stone that I showed is right on this line here. Here's the house that Kringle lived in, the Hoban Farm, and this is the open space behind. The village green, as you can see, is heavily treed on the north side of Main Street in this 1900s sketch, providing a bird's eye view. This is that same map again. And here's that open field, which is technically known as the the North Meadow, looking from Sabbath Day Path south towards Main Street. Kringle had some financial difficulties by the time of the Depression, and he lost this property in a foreclosure action. A 2-acre parcel was purchased at foreclosure by Henry Cannon, who lived across the street in, I think it was 1932. He died shortly thereafter, 2 or 3 years later, and his widow decided to donate this parcel to the town of Huntington as a memorial to her husband, and also as a way to implement some of the plans that the Old Huntington Green Incorporated had developed in trying to preserve the open space and historic character of the original town spot of the town of Huntington. So this plaque is on another boulder on the north end of the North Meadow, where the intersection of Sabbath Day Path and Park Avenue. So Old Huntington Green, in order to implement its plan to preserve the historic character of the area, hired some historians and Pratt Institute to identify the historic houses in the Village Green area and determine whether they were worthy of preservation. They identified about 2.5 dozen or more historic buildings that were in remarkably good condition and a remarkably intact collection in a concentrated space that they thought would be really a wonderful project for preservation. It's kind of on the lines of Williamsburg in Virginia, which had just really been started by the Rockefellers a decade earlier. And there was a thought that we could do something similar here in the town of Huntington, almost a Williamsburg North. And to publicize their findings, they had the Pratt Institute prepare this map, this illustration really. It's not geographically accurate at all, but it does show where all these historic buildings are. I can point out a couple. We have Old First Church on Main Street. If you're familiar with across from Ketchum Museum, there's an octagon house. There actually used to be 2. One of them was torn down, but one still survives. There's some other houses here. This is, I think, the Arsenal on Park Avenue. So there's a great collection of houses, and they wanted to implement this grand plan that would preserve the area from the Village Green all the way up through Huntington Harbor. They went to Marshall Field, the owner of Compset and heir to the Chicago department store fortune, and said, "This is the plan we want to implement." And he said, "Sounds good. How much is it going to cost?" And they said, "Well, it'll cost about $1 million." And he said, "Let me think about it." thought about it and he said, I can give you 75,000. So not nearly enough to implement the plan. And by the time this all came together, World War II was starting, and a lot of the wealthy patrons, such as Marshall Field, had their philanthropic attentions directed elsewhere, helping refugees from Europe. And so the plan never really fully took off, but some of it was implemented. And as we'll see as we go through this presentation, it was implemented not only by Old Huntington Green, but by other groups, the town, private individuals, and organizations such as the Historical Society, who may not, in each case, have necessarily understood that they were implementing a plan developed in the 1930s. One part of that plan involved the houses on Sabbath Day Road. So this is Main Street and Park Avenue. This is the historic Village Green, and this is that North Meadow that Mrs. Cannon donated to the town. Kringle, before he went bankrupt, managed to build 8 houses on Sabbath Day Path. And here's the Kringle House, which actually Reverend Humston from Old First Church moved here in 1940 when he retired from the pulpit at Old First. Old Huntington Green, working in secret and using straw men to make purchases, purchased each of these 4 lots identified here on Main Street. This is the Cannon gift, the historic Village Green, and this is where the house had been that they tore down. This lot, this lot, this lot, this lot, they all purchased, and once they had them all assembled, donated them to the town in the late 1950s for use as open space. They also purchased some of the houses on Sabbath Day Path, and the intention was to purchase these houses and then tear them down so that we'd have a continuous green swath from the Village Green through the North Meadow, across Sabbath Day Path into Heckscher Park. Heckscher Park had only been established in 1917, so that was a relatively new green space in town as well. So over the years, 4 of the houses have been demolished and 4 still survive. 2 are owned by Old Huntington Green. This greenhouse is owned by Old Huntington Green, and the yellow house is privately owned. And here, the brown house is owned by Old Huntington Green, and the white house is privately owned. Old Huntington Green's intention is once they pay off the mortgages, they're renting these houses out now. Once they pay off the mortgages, they will donate them to the town. The houses will be torn down and will have increased green space. One example of where that happened is at the south end, the southernmost of the 8 lots was purchased and donated to the town in 1990. And the Old Huntington Green installed this plaque dedicated to the Dr. DeVito, who was president of Old Huntington Green in the late 80s. You may know him as the father of our town board member, Joan Sergel. There's one historical error with this marker because it says that the land is return this piece of the historic town green to the people of Huntington. This was never part of the historic town green. It was separate and north of where the green was, as we saw on the earlier maps. But the intention is to expand what was the historic town green, and that has been done, certainly with the North Meadow. To celebrate and commemorate the donation of those first 4 plots I showed you, Old Huntington Green had this fountain created from 2 of the millstones from the original mill in Huntington that was up on Mill Lane. The millstones were just lying in someone's backyard, so they brought them over here and created the fountain, which unfortunately has not worked for years, but it would be nice if we could ever get that up and going. Here's the explanation of the Village Green fountain. The 5th piece of property that was marked number 5 on the earlier map has this barn or maintenance shed is now used by the town of Huntington. The owner of that property in the 1950s wanted to build an office building there, but Old Huntington Green convinced the town board to purchase the property so that the plan that they had would be fully implemented. So while it's in public ownership, unfortunately, it's not green space. It is a maintenance shed that all the mowing equipment to maintain the Village Green and Heckscher Park is kept. And it would be nice to move that, but they need a place to keep the mowers. So if we find another location for mowers, maybe someday this can be opened up into grassy space as well. While we're on the Village Green and the historic importance of it, one of its historic aspects that came much later is the Vietnam Memorial. which was dedicated in 1972. Be celebrating its 50th anniversary soon. This was one of the first memorials to the Vietnam War anywhere in the country, and perhaps the first living memorial. It is a living memorial because the memorial is not just this rock with the plaque, it is cherry trees, Kwanzaa cherry trees that you see off in the distance. There's one cherry tree for each man from Huntington who died fighting in Vietnam. As you can see, the names are listed here. They added a few more names in the 1990s that they didn't have originally, 7 more names. The Kwanzaa trees have not done very well in this very wet environment, and a lot of them had to be replaced over the years. But the tree was picked because the flower buds on these trees drop at their height, at their peak, just as these young men dropped at their peak as young men fighting in Vietnam. There's a close-up of all the names that were dedicated in 1972. Back to Toby.
Okay, well, now I think what we want to look at are some of those houses that we saw on the map that was done by Pratt Institute in the late 1930s, and where the plan was never implemented by the group or as a single entity. Most of the houses seem to have, or of the 32 houses that were identified, 28 of those houses, I believe, still stand today, and some are in private ownership, some are in public ownership, some are in nonprofit ownership, and we're going to go through them. What you're looking at now is the north extension of Park Avenue, north of Main Street, and there was a house there. It's no longer that, but it was built by Smith Woodhull, who came to town in the mid 19th century and becomes a very significant person in builder of houses as a wealthy person in town, as we'll see as we go through this talk. This is the, again, road to Cow Harbor is going off to your right, and the Main Street, extension of Main Street into the village is to your left. The house on the corner was replaced by the house that exists today, and Old Huntington Green, Inc. had a lot to do with this, because in the 1950s, there was an existing early gas station on the southwest corner, the southeast corner of that intersection, and they wanted to put another gas station on the northeast corner, which meant tearing down that house and building something new. And Old Huntington Green, Inc. convinced the owner of the property that a gas station or another gas station would not be an appropriate addition to the historic district, and convinced them that they could build a commercial use property there as long as it looked like an historic building. And they convinced the owners of the property to build this I've lost the name of
replica salt box.
Salt box, right? A replica of a salt box, not knowing how significant that was really, or maybe seeing a picture of a similar house that was in Huntington. So this was built in 1954. They also in 54 wanted to establish a YMCA, and it was going to be above the old Huntington, the town plot, and they felt it should be historically significant. And of course, at the time, and if you think of Williamsburg and all the brick Georgian architecture that's there, that was the concept of colonial America. And so they built this out of brick with a portico as an entranceway. And we're going to see this repeated several times more as an interpretation of what would be appropriate infill in the historic district. But there were contributing houses to the historic district, and this is one of them that is just south of the intersection, the southeast intersection of 25A and Main Street on Park Avenue. This was the Ebenezer Jarvis House. He was a blacksmith and a carriage maker who built this house in 1838. And it is meticulously restored as an historic property. It's been owned by several families, but the existing owner now is very loyal to the house and has it looking as it did somewhat in 1838 when it was built. The next house along the road is the Solomon Ketchum House, which was built in about the 1820s. It is said to have used, when they tore that first church, old first church down during the Revolution, they saved its timbers, and some of the timbers were used in building of this house that existed, or that still exists there. Now, the next slide is going to show what can happen as a modern addition to an historic house appropriately. The current owners have a young family with a couple of children, and they needed more room. It was really unsafe to raise in such a tiny house that was in front. So they built an addition off to the back, and in this picture, it is so overgrown you hardly see it from the road, but it is an appropriate in both the style and in scale of the houses that surround it, the historic houses that surround it. So where the house in front is maintained as the historic house, the whole complex looks like it belongs. The next house was a house that was in very bad shape in the 1930s. It was bought by a private family, the Metcalf family, but it was built, it's considered the oldest house in Huntington because of the 1.5-story structure that stands to the south. The addition was put on in the late 18th century, and the whole thing is a very historic structure and is meticulously restored. Rex Metcalf was the son of the people that restored it. Unfortunately, he's passed away. Many of you will remember him, and his family still lives there. Of course, the next house along Park Avenue as you go south or southeast was known as the Powell Jarvis House when it was bought by the Huntington Historical Society in 1968. And at the time, it was thought to be the oldest house in Huntington because, again, you see a 1.5 structure there to the south end of it. That was thought to be an early settlement house from the 17th century. However, when they had extensive restoration done, they realized that the house was all built as once, and it was built as a Long Island half house, where you traditionally would have at the time a 5-bay colonial. They put 3 bays, which included the front door, on one side, made it 2 stories, and then put the utility wing or the kitchen wing off to the south. Is very similar to what was done at the Whitman House. It was built at a similar time. This house was built all in one piece, well, except for the lean-to kitchen that was added on in the 1840s. It was originally built in 1795, and it was built by Timothy Jarvis for Dr. Daniel Whitehead Kissam, who came to town. And of course, he's my 3-great-grandfather, and that's one of the reasons I have a passion for Huntington's history. In the 1940s and 50s, the home was purchased by a portrait artist, Hilda Taylor, and the roof was raised on the lower portion of the house to make it a full 2-story house. It still didn't reach the scale of the original 2-story, but it was to produce a art studio for Hilda Taylor, who owned it at the time. Now, she's a fascinating character and a very good portrait artist, as the next slide will show, I hope, yes. In 1955, General Foods or General Mills, I think, whoever owned the image to Betty Crocker. Betty Crocker was actually established in 1939, and an image was produced. It was a composite of which a typical homeowner may look like. Well, in 1955, she was getting a little stale, according to the company, and they decided to run a contest between illustrators and portrait artists to submit for a new Betty Crocker. And 6 artists were invited, including Norman Rockwell. And Hilda Taylor's submission, which was the portrait of Muriel Wadsworth, who was a neighbor, won. And so a Huntington woman became Betty Crocker for about 10 years. And this is the image that was used. Another interesting house that no longer sits on its original foundation, but was on that survey that was done in 1939, is what we call the Adams House. Now, the Adams House stood at the foot of what is today Maple Hill Road on Huntington Hospital property, and where the parking garage is today. They wanted to move it. They knew it was an historic house, and they thought they could it would be appropriate if it was moved into the backside of the Kissam property on Woodhull Avenue, and which is where it sits today. So again, it's the idea of taking an historic house and moving it into the historic district, though this also came from the historic district. So it was the implementation of that grand plan. Now, the house just south of the Kissam House was the Silas Wood House. Silas Wood was the Huntington's first representative to the Congress, and he was also a Long Island historian. He descended from Jonas Wood through Samuel Wood, and this was the original plot of that Wood family, would have been just south of the Kissam property. And even though his family had moved to West Hills when he was born, when he got back from Congress, he decided to build the family homestead, which looked like this.
Not to build it, to move to it.
To move to it, I'm sorry. This would have been an original settlement house. Thank you. Now, there's a second view of this house from the side, and that shows the definite salt box style that was used on the Huntington Green. So that makes that that replica that stands at the northeast corner of the intersection of Park Avenue and Main Street even more appropriate, and as stylistic to the houses that were built in the early settlement. This house was torn down in 1881 when it was becoming not appropriate for modern living, I guess, and this Victorian house was built. It's been the property was recently bought by Tom Hogan, and his idea, again, not knowing that he was implementing a plan, was to build an office complex there. So he got permission for C1 zoning that he would turn and restored the original house. There, he also restored, which was Sunny Pond Farms, worked out of there for many years, the garage, and that actually may be the oldest house on the property because it may go back to the Wood family's early settlement. But he also wanted to save other historic houses that he found and were in danger of being destroyed, and to move back and create this office complex. So he found a house in Old Bridge Road in East Northport, which is here on its original location. He only did not move the newer addition that was to the right, and he moved just this part of the house to the property. And then he found a house that was just up Woodhull Road, which was known as the Chichester House. It's in the historic district, is on that historic map that was done. And but it was vacant and it was torn down, it was falling down in danger of destruction. And so he moved that house to the property and created his office complex, which we'll see here. This is the Chichester House. After it was moved, it was put at the back side of that office complex here on the property, and this is the house from Old Bridge Road that is the front of it. And again, kind of unbeknownst to the grand plan, he moves historic houses into the historic district and to preserve them. And so it fits into that grand plan, increases the number of historic houses in the district.
Another part of the Old Huntington Green Association's plan was to preserve open space. And that was, again, unwittingly implemented by people when they were protesting development of an 8-acre parcel at the end of Hillaire Drive up the hill from Park Avenue, as known as Hillaire Woods. They would have an access road coming in from Park Avenue between these houses and build condominiums in this wooded hillside. Scott Johnson, who was chairman of the Historic Preservation Committee at the time, was deeply involved in preserving this open space. And he said, traditionally, people who preserve open space were one group, and people who preserve historic buildings are another group, and they've never really come together. But of course, they had come together with Old Huntington Green. And now, 70 years later, they were coming together again to preserve this open space and create a heritage trail that would tie together all the historic properties in town behind all the properties, so people could walk through here. And originally it was proposed as a loop. We'd come through the Park Avenue Dairy property, which we'll talk about a little later, up Murray Court and through the school property to Spring Street and then back to the beginning. Now we envision it as a trail that starts at Hillaire Woods, comes up through the Village Green and the North Meadow to Heckscher Park. And I would like someday to see it come up to the harbor if it was possible to do that in some way. This is a view of Hillaire Woods. You can see it's very wooded, and it really does seem like you're in the middle of nowhere almost, even though you're right off of Park Avenue. It's pretty secluded up once you get up the hill. And these are the woods here, and this is Park Avenue down here. Now, a big linchpin of the Heritage Trail would be the Park Avenue dairy property, which is on the corner of Park Avenue and Woodhull Street, right across from the Kissam House and the Huntington Jewish Center. This is a map drawn in the 1980s when Eugene Sweezy wrote a book about his family's ownership of Park Avenue Dairy. So this map shows what the property looked like in 1915. As you can see, there was pasture for cows. This had been used for dairy purposes and cattle raising for about 266 years, since the earliest days of the town of Huntington. There's a pond on Park Avenue, and behind that pond was an old farmhouse, and this is that farmhouse, which dates, we believe, to the 17th century. In 1915, the Sweezy family decided to move this house from facing Park Avenue to over on Woodhull Street, where it still stands. The Chichester House that Toby mentioned, that was moved across to the Tom Hogan property, Hoban Farm, stood over here on Woodhull Street. This is the farm in 1937. By then, of course, there was a new farmhouse behind the pond, this big white house. Here's the house that they had moved from the pond to Woodhull, and here was the Chichester House right next to it. And they also in 1915 added a concrete dairy barn and a tile silo for storing silage for the cows. I should go back and tell you what happened to that property. That might be helpful. There was a proposal to develop a congregate care facility on the Park Avenue dairy site back in the late 90s. And that was not successful. It's a difficult site to develop, not only because it's in a historic district, which means you have to protect the historic buildings on the property, but also because it's very wet. It's on a hillside, and there are springs. This whole area, you see here, it says spring. Water just flows out of the ground there, and now it saturates this whole property going down to the corner, where it's eventually caught into the culvert under Park Avenue. But it's very wet, so it's difficult to develop. So the congregate care facility plan did not come to fruition. Another purchaser wanted to build a synagogue here. Again, there were problems with developing it. So then he tried to have a condominium development, which would cluster the condominiums in one portion of the property and leave the rest as open space. That also was unsuccessful for a variety of reasons. Eventually, what he ended up doing was selling the farmhouse and an acre and a half, including the pond and the milk house, to a private owner, selling this original house to another owner, and the rest he sold to the town of Huntington. So the town of Huntington now owns all this land through here where the cow barn is and up down to the corner. And the hope is that the Heritage Trail will come up through the woods and maybe even go right through the middle of the cow barn, out the other side, and down to the Village Green. And on the way to the Village Green, as you hike the Heritage Trail, you would pass the arsenal. The arsenal was originally built as a granary in 1747, and later expanded and used as a residence, converted to residential use. Job Samus purchased the property in 1751, and he was a weaver. So he lived here with his family. He had many children. It was a very small house. And his loom takes up a large portion of the main room of downstairs. And that's sort of the way people lived and worked back in the 18th century. It became known as the Arsenal because during the lead up to the Revolutionary War, the militia would train on the Village Green, and they asked Job Samus if they could store their arms in his house instead of bringing them back and forth from home. And the Provincial Congress sent the Suffolk militia 100 pounds of gunpowder, which was stored in his house as well. And then when the British took over in Huntington in September of 1776, it ceased to be used as an arsenal. So it was held ammunition for maybe a year and a half, very brief period, but we continue to call it the arsenal. And it was continued to be a residence until the 1980s. This is what it looked like in the 20th century. In the early 1970s, the town purchased the property to restore it to its appearance during the American Revolution and when Job Samus was there. But the woman who lived in the house was given a life estate to the back part of the house. Over here was a studio apartment built, and the front half was restored to the 18th century. In 2012, many years after the woman had died, that studio apartment was also restored to the 18th century. A new wing was added in the back to hold all the mechanical equipment, and now the house looks, the house looks the way it did when Job Samus lived there. Those columns that had been added have been removed. And the Huntington Militia opens the house on special occasions and does encampments and drills on the village green, especially around the third Sunday in July to commemorate the reading of the Declaration of Independence when it reached Huntington on July 22nd, 1776. I'll go back to Toby. He's going to tell us more about Woodhull.
We'll look at some more of those houses that are still being used and saved that were on that historic map. And they have second uses, which is preserving them beautifully. The three houses that I've circled here, two of which still stand just to the east of Old Town Hall, they were built by that Smith Woodhull that we talked about, who came to the town in 1850. He also built a house behind there, but that property now that house was taken down, and the property is the YMCA property. So we'll see these two houses. This is the historic Smith Woodhull house. It is the house that Ida Bunce Samus, who was a suffragette in the early 20th century. After she got married, she grew up on, she was born on Goose Hill Road, married a Samus, and moved into this house, and there's a commemorative marker now marking that, and is now an office building. It looks like a residence, but it's used now as an office building. The house next door to it is the same. They're owned by the same family, and they both survive today because they were zoned C1 commercial to allow offices to go in there, and that has saved and preserved the historic nature of the structure. Woodhull Samus, Smith Woodhull, I'm sorry, was also happened to be president of the school board in 1857 when the Union Free School District was established, and he owned the property where the present town hall is today, so it was convenient for him to build another one of his Italianate structures, and we're going to see yet a fifth one of those buildings that were built to act as the school building, the high school, until 1910 almost, when the new high school, today's town hall, was opened up. You can see the children that were all lined up in this great picture, plus the guy up at the top holding on to the flagpole.
Hooligan.
You can see in 1898, they decided they needed a more building, so they built an elementary school building that's here. The same architect that was for the trade school that's owned by the Historical Society and the old Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Building was used to design this building, and it was built next to the high school, this old wooden high school, until that was torn down and replaced in 1909. It was started and replaced by this structure. Today, of course, the two brick buildings are united, as you see here from a view from Old First Church steeple that Robert and I managed to climb to take this photograph. And you can see the two buildings now as they stand today as Town Hall and the plaza in front of it.
We climbed on the inside of the steeple, not the outside.
Yes, yes. We were not steeplejacks. So this goes back to the map that we've been looking at. You can see that Union School there at the bottom in the middle. That's the old wooden structure still in 1873. Across the street is Old First Church. You see the two Smith Woodhull buildings just to the east of the school. You see the Hoban building still on that open space that is now part of the town green, the Hoban House. You see the Episcopal Church just down Park Avenue, and next to that is the African Methodist Episcopal Church that was replaced in the 20s by the present church. And you see a number of the houses that we've seen along Park Avenue, including the intersection, the East Main Street intersection. You can see it's still a left-hand turn there. You'll see the store in front and the Jeffrey Amherst Woodhull house, which was the son of Smith Woodhull. And we're going to now look at that corner and intersection. This is, of course, originally was where Platt's Tavern was. As I said, when it was first, the plots were laid out, individual families were given lots of land. This was the original Isaac Platt property that ran on the south side of the road to Cow Harbor. And during the bicentennial, the thought was, and the town historian at the time, Rufus Langhans, wanted to rebuild Platt's Tavern on that corner. And this was the vision that was given of Platt's Tavern by John Collins. Now, in that book that was written in 1938, talks about Platt's Tavern, describes it as it's written here. It said on the east side there was an addition made. I'm not so sure the east side was there or on the other to the right of this building where it may have originally stood. But John Collins took that information and came up with his rendering of Platt's Tavern. Romanus Emmis says that in 1850, when the Jeffrey Amherst house was built, that Platt's Tavern was torn down. Turns out that it wasn't torn down, that there was a picture album in our archives that we were rustling through one day and had this picture in the description of an old house formerly on the Pottery property on Huntington Harbor, removed from East Street near the Common. Now, East Street near the Common, we could account for all the buildings that would have been there, except for Platt's Tavern. It's since been determined, and it was well documented at the time, that Platt's Tavern wasn't torn down, but moved to the Pottery property, which is just north of the Haleside Park on East Shore Road. And this is right at the corner of that property up on by East Shore Road, facing the park. And it was owned by Obadiah Platt. Let me just go back to that genealogy transformation a minute. And Mary Carl, at the time, George Washington. Now, the significance of this, of course, and the reason Platt's Tavern becomes so significant was because in 1790, when General Washington, or President Washington then, was making his tour of Long Island to thank the spy ring, he came along the South Shore initially to as far as Patchogue, went north to Setauket, and then came along the North Shore. It stopped at Platt's Tavern for lunch and had what he defined as a tolerably good lunch given by Widow Platt, because Obadiah Platt, her husband, had died in 1770, and it was being run by his wife. Gilbert Platt inherited the property, married Phoebe Platt, his wife, and then they had Mary Ann Platt, who died in 1845, but she had married Henry S. Lewis. And in 1845, Henry S. Lewis owned the pottery site. He owned the pottery, and those of you who collect Huntington pottery may be fortunate enough to have some Lewis pottery, because there are some of it that's marked. And so that's the reason that it was moved to the pottery site. So it stays the same. Here is a better picture of it when it was in better shape. It was rented for years when it was on the pottery site, and actually burned down in 1915, so we no longer have it. But here it is up at the corner. It's a blown up photograph of the parkland, really, but it zeroes in and shows the position of it up at that corner of the Brown Brothers Pottery at East Shore Road.
And it's another salt box.
And it's another salt box. This shows it again. Thank you. Now, what did that corner look like after it was torn, after it was moved to the Pottery House? Well, to the Pottery property? Well, Jeffrey Amherst Woodhull built a store here and that eventually enlarged it into a hotel. He also built one of those Italianate houses that really sat on what is today the parking lot of the deli property. And then a later owner built this structure in 1898, which is currently the deli that sits there on the property, or the former deli that sits on that property. This shows the property with all three structures on it. You can see where Main Street, which way do you go? Does the Main Street go to the right, which would be Park Avenue, or does it turn left and go to Northport? And you can see it was rather confusing at that point. But in the at some point, well, the structure, the hotel and the store was torn down in the early 1920s, and this was the first gas station that was put up there, the Lighthouse gas station that stood for many years. The second photograph shows that coming east from Main Street, and again, you see by this time the main road was going to Northport, and it was at this when this photograph was taken, that they were trying to widen and straighten out the road, which they somewhat successfully did. You have more of a sense that you're going straight to Northport than onto Park Avenue, and you have to make the right-hand turn to Park Avenue. If you look in front of that millstone that sits on the village green, you can see kind of a flat area, which was hard pan that never really grew as lush grass as the rest of it. We think that's the original road that would have gone on, merged into Park Avenue. Now, in the 1950s, when that early gas station was decided that it needed to modernize, they first built they built what again we define as the colonial style gas station. They made it out of brick, they put a cupola in it so it would fit more into the historic neighborhood. I'm not so sure it was ever very successful, but this is what it looked like when it was an active gas station.
And maybe we should point out here that although there's been commercial use of this corner for well over a century and a half, when town adopted a zoning code in 1934, they zoned all this property as residential. Everywhere along Park Avenue and East Main Street was zoned for residential use, even though there had been commercial use on this corner, including, of course, the gas station.
Thanks, yeah. And of course, then it was bought by a developer who intends to do something different with the property. This is when it was vacant as a gas station. He had an artist come in and commemorate the visit of Washington in 1790. That mural has since been moved to the South Huntington, the old South Huntington Library there on Depot Road, and Depot and Melville Road, I guess it's called. And it shows the Collins version of the Platt's Tavern with the extension along 25A, and the general bigger than life visiting and talking, addressing the town folks.
That's because Toby hadn't discovered that photo album when this mural was made.
Right, or when John Collins had done his rendering. And this is kind of what it looks like today. It's been repainted. At one point, it was painted in all sorts of different colors. It's now painted as a more solid color. The future of this intersection, of course, is very dear to the historic district. The proposal that was initially shown for this corner property, which would include the thing, well, we'll show that later. This was a later proposal that was more acceptable to preservationists and to historians, because where it's a single block building still, it was 8,000 square feet, not 10, and it was broken up to look like historic structures. It looked like the style and scale of buildings that would have fit into the historic district, which would have satisfied the code of the historic district. Unfortunately, the developer now has a sign up where he's reverted back to a single block, monolithic 10,000 square foot building. that he would like to put there. Again, we hope this doesn't happen. We hope that we can get some kind of encouragement, as the Old Huntington Green was successful in the 1950s, to build something that is more appropriate in style and scale to the historic district. That to a great extent has been preserved, thanks in large part to lots of different people, and none including Old Huntington Green Inc., which came up with the original vision of what could be done, and then private properties, the Huntington Historical Society, the town of Huntington, private individuals restoring their homes and keeping them in appropriateness to the historic original settlement. And I think that's it, isn't it? Yeah. Oh, we still have geese on the the band didn't work. So I guess we'll try to answer any questions that you may have. And so we'll go back to Tracy and see whether she has anything, but thank you all for listening.
Maybe I'll go back. Don't read that yet.
All right, thank you so much, Robert and Toby. Let me pull up our chat box here. I saw some questions coming in. All right.
One question that I happened to see was the Sweezy Dairy the same as the Brush Dairy? And the answer to that is no. The Brush Dairy was further south on Park Avenue, not too much further south, but where the Brush House still stands, though it's a multi-family dwelling now, I think.
By the sump.
By the sump, yeah.
Okay. Someone asks about the slides, if there's somewhere we can access these slides.
The pictures?
Well, you're going to go ahead, Robert.
They're from the collection of the Huntington Historical Society. You're going to post this presentation online?
Yes, I am recording it, so hopefully everything worked out. I realized about 10 minutes in that it was recording my screen and I was looking at the chat box and participants, so the start might be a little rough. But yes, we are going to put the recording up as long as everything went according to plan. So I will share that with all of the attendees, and that will be on our website. So Cheryl, I'll let you know about that.
Or if someone wanted copies of these photographs, they can get in touch with the archivist of the Historical Society once you reopen.
That's right, yes. So Karen, our archivist, could certainly help you with access to any of the photos that were used today. All right, someone asked, has there ever been an archaeological dig of the village green?
I don't believe there has. Archaeological digs are expensive undertakings. I'm not aware that it's ever been done.
They did do an archaeological dig at the arsenal and found some things a while back, which of course is adjacent to the green. But I don't know of any. That would be a large undertaking.
Yeah, and it may be something that would yield significant fines because it has not really been disturbed in forever. It has certainly changed its contours with the pond, the migrating pond, and the stream seems to have meandered and taken different courses over the years. But there's nothing ever built on it other than Thomas Fix's barns. So it could yield something, but on the other hand, if it was not a site of direct development, there may be fewer things that fell out of people's pockets and into the ground. But it was well used as a center market and a place to herd the cattle. So there could be something there.
Okay.
And geese.
Geese. All right. Someone asked, was Hilaire Woods once part of the property that the nursing home mansion is now on?
Yes,
actually,
I believe
the mansion, the nursing home was a mansion that preceded Hilaire Woods. I mean, what the development was.
Right. I don't think Hilaire Woods was ever part of the nursing home property, but before the nursing home, that was the Vernon estate, owned a large tract of land up on the top of the hill there. So it probably was part of that property and was subdivided off at some some point in the 20th century.
Okay. Here we have the Park Avenue Dairy. Was it the same as the Brush Dairy? We just answered that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And Cheryl also mentioned when we were looking at the mural that was on the side of the Platts Tavern building that Eric Price painted it, P-R-E-I-S.
Right. Yeah. And again, you can see that still. It's on the side of the old South Huntington Library out in Melville, or
South Huntington.
well, yeah, just north of the turnpike. I don't know what it's called there.
Okay. How many historic buildings have been moved?
Well, that's a good question. I saw that question. We the two buildings were moved. Two buildings were historic buildings in the district were moved in the district. One to the Kissam property and one to the Hogan property. The East Northport House was moved to the Hogan property. Robert, can you think of another structure that was moved?
Well, it depends on when you're talking about. Historically, people would move houses quite often. It's surprising, but if you have a perfectly good structure, it was easier to move it than to start from scratch and start milling new lumber and building a new house.
Actually, there were several other houses that were moved. One was moved into the district from the harbor. It's the one that sits at the end of the park as you go north on Park Avenue, as it bends to the right by the Cannon House there. Straight ahead was the Zebulon Carl House that sat down at the harbor. And the interesting story with that is there's a back half wing of that. And there is some speculation that that was the tap room that sat next to Platt's Tavern, because it was moved also to the harbor at one point, and it was attached to this house and then moved with it. It was actually moved in two parts by the Village Green. So that wasn't moved until the 1950s, and yet somebody altered that map that was done in 1939 to include that house in the map. They added that house to the map. So that's another house that was moved.
Yeah, in more modern times, I can't think of too many houses that have been moved. And it seems
No, not in the district, but the two houses that were up on Maple Hill were moved again by the hospital and moved along south on Park Avenue, just south of the Jewish Center. On Park Avenue, there are two houses that are in a flag lot. One's in a flag lot, one's on the street. Those two houses had been moved from Maple Hill Road to make room for more parking at the hospital.
it was almost easier to move a house before the 20th century because you didn't have telephone lines to worry about, and electric lines.
Right.
That's sometimes the most difficult part of moving a structure.
Okay. Another question. I used to live on Cannon Court and heard that it was once an orchard. Is that true?
I wouldn't be surprised. That was all part of the Cannon property. He owned all of that land, and the historic house on the corner of Cannon Court and Park Avenue is known as the Little Cannon House. He owned that as well, and I wouldn't be surprised if he had an orchard in that area.
Okay. Why isn't the green more user-friendly? It is always empty.
The Art League used to do art shows on the North Meadow every year, and you used to see more people playing football and other things there. It had gotten very wet over the years because I think the drainage on Park Avenue was not working the way it was supposed to. So anytime there was a heavy storm, all the water floods into that valley anyway, which is why there's a stream. But the drainage that was supposed to catch that water would flood onto the North Meadow, and it would just be soaking wet for days, if not weeks, after a rain. I was just there the other day after all the rain we had somewhat recently, and it is firm soil. They have addressed the drainage problem, and it seems to be fixed now. I'm not sure they're going to have fairs and festivals the way they did with the Art League, but it's certainly something that more people should be able to go out and enjoy. The Village Green itself, there's not much you could do in terms of active use other than strolling through it, which I would encourage people to do. And maybe people want to get together one Saturday morning and pick up the litter and trim some of the vines back. But it does need some attention, but doesn't really lend itself to active uses.
Someone asked, is there a walking tour available?
There is a printed walking tour that Rex Metcalf put together several years ago. I don't think it's in print, but certainly copies could be made from the copies we have in the file.
One of the things we hope is going to happen with the Heritage Trail is that there are going to be markers along the Heritage Trail that will point out the different historic structures that they're seeing as they walk through and down through the woods and down into across the park. Of course, how those markers get paid for is got to be determined, but we first have to clean up the trail, and then that's hopefully will happen.
All right, and we at the Historical Society would be happy to help with that walking tour and distributing it. That's a great idea. All right, does Tom Hogan still own Sunny Pond Farm?
Yes.
Okay.
And as somebody mentioned, that office complex is now the office of Congressman Swazi. I noticed that somebody had mentioned that along the way. He is the first and so far the only tenant of that complex. He took over both buildings as part of his congressional office.
Okay, people are starting to have to run, so we have 2 more questions here. Are there any plans to do an ecological restoration of the village green, removing invasive plants and planting native plants that would have been there historically?
Well, that's a sensitive subject because the most prominent invasive or non-native species that is there are the cherry trees that make up the Vietnam Memorial. And I think we have to be very careful about dismantling a memorial. Maybe if a new location could be found, that's something that the Veterans Committee could consider. But otherwise, yeah, it would be nice to clean up some of the other things that are there. If somebody could help identify what is invasive there, that would be great. It should be more open space, green space with more grass rather than some of the trees that they have other than the cherry trees. But that's, it's something that's up to the town to decide how they want to handle that. But I think it would be a great idea.
Okay. Couple of comments, people saying thank you so much, Robert and Toby. To your credit to provide such an intriguing, delightful afternoon. Thank you. Great presentation. A comment, the Nathan Hale Trail begins by the Arsenal and heads down Main Street.
Yes.
Local Troop 32, Boy Scouts of America, may be able to help if there is a cleanup effort. And a lot of thanks for a wonderful talk. So thank you so much to everyone. We are so happy that you chose to spend this time with us and learn a little more about Huntington's history. Someone just asked, who do we contact about that walking tour? I'm going to send some information to other participants today. I'm going to send all the info on the slide here, send some information about the Historical Society and membership if you're interested. And then we also have a game that we're doing right now and for the next 4 weeks. This is most of the cultural institutions in the town of Huntington, the history institutions are participating in this. And it's where in Huntington is Carl Ampelman? And it's sort of a, where is Carmen Sandiego idea. And Carl, who is a visitor from Eastern Germany, I missed a Y there, he is here exploring Huntington's historic sites. So we have 7 photographs every week of Carl somewhere in Huntington. And it's a game to see if you can identify where Carl is. It's multiple choice. There are 7 of them, as I mentioned, and so far the average has been 5 out of 7. So see if you are better than the average. And I am going to post that in the chat link, and I'll send that to you, and it's on our website as well. Robert, Toby, any last words?
Carl joined us and watched the video presentation.
Oh, thanks. Good, Carl. What did you think, Carl? I guess you know, we may try this again if people are interested, and we may get some feedback on that.